Everybody, welcome back to Final Residence TV and episode number 28 of Van Halen Stories. Today, my guest is Jas Obrecht, and if you guys know Jas, he goes way back to Guitar Player magazine in 1978. His career started in California with Guitar Player from 78 to 98. Is that right?
Yeah.
20 years. Been published over 150 times in different music publications across the world. Of course, all his Van Halen stories that we know about through the different special issues and later on, we're all familiar with your work, and I'm glad to have you today. One of the last things that I saw that you had was the final tribute to Eddie and Guitar Player, his final story that was published in the tribute issue, right? Of the original 1978 interview, the first interview of Eddie Van Halen that you did. And so that was awesome to see, and awesome to see that back there again. And I got to tell you, looking and listening through all of your podcasts, which people need to know that you have this Talking Guitar YouTube channel now, where all of your interviews are now archived with all the audio from these artists. So that's one of the really cool things about when you first released the Van Halen one. It was so cool to hear it in his voice and hear it with you at that event, and it's an amazing thing. So I appreciate you being with us. Y'all check out that YouTube channel. There's over 5 hours of recently released, the 5-hour interview from 1980, a 79 interview that you did as a phoner, and a 78 interview in person, of course, at the Day on the Green, which is the famous interview we're going to talk about today. So does that kind of cover it? And plus more after that, right? More interviews after that.
Yeah, Eddie and I did a lot of other interviews.
Yeah, we'll talk about what you did after these initial ones. Getting into this first interview, well, let's talk about your career. This is an interesting thing I read about you, is that you started out as a guitar player and then you transitioned into journalism and sent your resume out to three particular magazines to potentially become a writer, and one of them needed a writer right away, and you got that job immediately, a guitar player.
Well, what happened was I was working for the Gale Research Company in downtown Detroit, and I found out that if they laid me off, I would have more income than I was making working 40 hours if I subtracted what I had to pay in parking. And so when I confronted them about it, they said, well, Gale Research doesn't set the unemployment rate. And that's all they would say. And so I decided I needed to get out of there. But the publishing house got all these magazines in every week. And we used to get Billboard, Cashbox, my favorite magazine, which is called Living Blues, and Guitar Player magazine. And I used to read Guitar Player, and I thought, these guys have the best gig in the world. They're getting paid to go around and talk to musicians about playing music.
Right.
And so on a whim, I sent my resume off to Guitar Player magazine, and it just happened to pass that it showed up on the day they let one of the 3 editors go. So that day there was an opening. And it was the only guitar magazine in America at that time. And the editor, bless his heart, a wonderful cat named Don Men, saw my resume and thought it was a sign from God that it arrived on that particular day. So they flew me out from Detroit to California for an interview. And within maybe an hour and a half, I'd been hired. And they sent me home to pack up my belongings into a truck and fly back and get to work. And I met Eddie about 5 or 6 weeks after that.
So how old were you then at this point?
I was 24.
Okay. So you're just a little bit old. Eddie was 23 at that point that you met him.
Yeah, Eddie wasn't always accurate about his age.
But we know he was 23 now.
Well, I assumed that we were very close to the same age.
Right. So, when I talked to you before about this first interview with Eddie Van Halen, I said, this should be my biopic intro, because for me, I'm visualizing this story, you walking into Oakland Coliseum. What are you carrying with you? You're carrying your recorder, a notebook. What else?
That was it.
So you go in. Can you tell that story? I know you've told it before.
Yeah. I was sent to interview Pat Travers. And so I was, it was a day-long Day on the Green Festival. I think AC/DC was the opening act, and then Van Halen and Aerosmith were the headliners, and Pat Travers was playing. This is before he had Pat Thrall in the band. anyways, I watched the Van Halen set and was blown away. And then after Travers played, I went to his tent. Bill Graham had a tent set up at the Oakland Coliseum, and I walked in, and Pat was sitting there with a couple of scantily clad young ladies. And the guy said, "Hey, the kid from Guitar Player's here to interview you." And Pat's like, "Send him away. I don't want to talk to anybody today." And, I just arrived from Detroit. I had a Detroit attitude,
Yeah.
and I was kind of angry. I have to be honest, because I didn't want to come back empty handed. And Bill Graham, bless his heart, um, always had something interesting backstage for musicians and journalists and people like that. And this time he had like a quarter basketball court set up, and nobody was using it. So I went over and I picked up a basketball and I started to just free throw. And this kid comes walking over and he goes, "Hey, man, can I shoot baskets with you?" I said, "Sure." So we played this spirited game of one-on-one. And I remember he was young looking, wiry, muscular, and he was very fast. I was surprised at what a good basketball player he was. He
Right.
had this hook shot where he'd go around you and do a hook shot, and I couldn't defend against it, and he whipped my ass. And so after we got done playing and sat down at the side of the court, he goes, "What band are you in?" I said, "I'm not in a band." He goes, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "I can't. I work for Guitar Player magazine. I came to interview Pat Travers, but Pat blew me off." He looks at me and he goes, "Pat Travers blew you off? I can't fucking believe it." He goes, "Why don't you interview me, man?" I go, "Well, who are you?" And he goes, "My name's Edward Van Halen." I'm like, "Whoa, okay, happy to do it." And luckily, a couple of weeks earlier, the first Van Halen album came in. It was either that one or there was a red one called the Van Halen mini album You Missed,
Right.
which I have a really vague recollection of.
That
And
the Looney Tunes one with the Looney Tunes character, the red.
yeah, that was it. Yeah. Anyways, after my first week or two at Guitar Player, I remember walking into Don Men's office, and he was standing at his turntable with Tom Wheeler and Tom Darter, the editor of Keyboard, and they were playing Eruption, and they were trying to figure out if that middle section with the finger tappings was a keyboard or a guitar. And these are like three of the most astute listeners in journalism. And at the time, Eddie's technique, he didn't invent it, but the way he used it was so revolutionary that we weren't absolutely sure it was being done on a guitar.
Right.
So I was delighted to sit down with Eddie. And then if you listen to the podcast called Eddie Van Halen, my first interview, you can hear exactly what happened when I said, "I'll be happy to interview you." And I sat down and turned on the tape.
Yeah.
And I just rolled it from there. That was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, to steal a line from Bogart.
Right, right. It was an amazing that story. I didn't know whether I didn't know if you had seen them yet. I mean, if that was before you played with him or after. So I was wondering about that. You just said it was after.
Yeah, I'd seen him play, and then we did the interview. And as soon as we were finished, that photograph of the two of us,
Right.
where I got the black and white guitar on, and he's got his arm around me, was taken. And one of the things, I see you got a copy of that guitar behind you.
Yeah.
One of the things that really stuck out to me about that guitar when I held it in my hand was it looked so homemade. It was funky. I mean, it was like it had been spray painted in a garage, and it looked like it. It had black tape, electrician's tape, to make the stripes.
Right.
And where the strings go through the nut before the headstock there, Eddie had filed it extra wide, all 6 of the spaces, which I'd never seen anyone do before. And his point was that when he was using the whammy bar, the string would bounce back into tune more easily because it wouldn't catch
Right.
on the nut slots.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So even back then, he was a total innovator when it came to the instrument. Hendrix and Chuck Berry and other people were also great guitar innovators who created a seismic shift in the ways that we see the instrument. But Eddie had that, and he also had a sort of luthier's view of it, a way of like redesigning the guitar that,
Right.
that these other players didn't have. So he was an interesting combination.
Yeah, he comes, that comes out in your interviews a lot. He talks about so much detail about the guitar and about the neck shape. And do you remember if it was heavy to you, or can you remember that?
It was light.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it was a light guitar.
Yeah, because it's made out of ash, everybody says, but yeah, ash is kind of heavy, but yeah, it's for you, it was light.
Well, I was used to picking up
That's
acoustic guitars and Les Pauls, and so for me, it was lighter than a Les.
okay. So yeah, because they can be 10 pounders for all for all well we know, yeah, right, yeah,
God forbid you get one with an ebony fingerboard.
right, right. I've had a few. I had an Explorer that was made out of walnut with maple. The E2s, remember the E2s from the early '80s?
And your arm would go numb after you played it for a while.
Could not play the guitar. It was beautiful, but it was brutal. So you said like even the finish was pretty rough hewn on that guitar when you saw it up close.
It was not. It didn't look like a professional like refinishing job, that's for sure. But again, that was the charm of Eddie.
Right, right. Right. That's amazing. Yeah, that whole story, you're back there and you're playing basketball with him. A lot of I'm actually interviewed one of his good friends when he was a kid, and they said he was very athletic, actually.
Oh yeah, he was really buff, and he had that kind of musculature that was common in young musicians who hauled their own amplifiers.
Right, right. And the
And
camp.
he had been, do all these gigs around Pasadena and all that. So he was tough. He was muscular.
Yeah, I've heard that from multiple people how fast he was too. Like really he was really fast and really muscular and very, very athletic, which
He
is
was also very fast mentally.
yeah, right, right. Yeah, those interviews show that. That's pretty cool. Did you at the time? Did you realize? I mean, I know you knew he was new and hot and everything, but did you realize it was going to be sort of a historical interview?
No, no, I just encountered him and I liked him as a person. We hit it off.
Right, right.
And then he started calling me up and on the road and using me as a sounding board. He'd send me demos and want to know what I thought of stuff, and he trusted me. And plus, he was an avid reader of Guitar Player magazine, which really helped.
Right. He mentions that when he talks about Charvel, the ads in there, and how he got parts from that. And he mentioned to you as he was talking, you advertise for the company I get these parts from and that kind of thing. He mentioned that
Yeah,
throughout that. And he goes on to say, the finish and everything, stripes are my thing, and he starts to talk to you about, the how long it took to make that first record and how Eruption was a late ad, which we all kind of know now, but and Jamie's Crying was a late add to that as well.
that the eruption put Eddie on the path of being a guitar hero, and I believe that was the beginning of the major friction with Dave.
Okay.
Eddie used to call me up and like late at night, early in the morning, and talk to me about the tensions he was feeling with Dave, because there came a point at one time where Dave just said no more guitar solos on the records
Oh wow. Okay.
because Dave didn't want, Dave wanted to be the front man, but
Sure.
Eddie was the one getting the adulation. And I would argue, Jeff, that was rightfully so.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he goes on later in your other interview to say that he realized Dave's talent as a talker, as a communicator, and he kind of goes into like he gives Dave props for his ability to be able to be on the spot.
He privately told me the reason they got Dave was really simple. They could rehearse at his house and save money. So, but it bothered Eddie that Dave like sang in one key most of the time.
Right, right,
So that was like the downside was he had to play in the same key a lot. But
right.
the plus side was his dad, Dave's dad, let him rehearse in their basement.
Yeah, that's an interesting, situation with the Van Halens. If you've ever been to their home, there in Pasadena versus Dave's house where he grew up and where they grew up. They're immigrant family, very like he talks more about his family there towards the end of your interviews. It's really interesting. But the difference in their social status, I guess, was pretty. It seemed pretty large. Dave's dad's a doctor. They're living here, in a very small home.
Was that was that house on Los Lunas
Yeah,
Avenue or something like that?
yeah,
Yeah, I remember. I used to have piece of paper where Eddie wrote down his home address and phone number. And it was fun. I mean, he was still living with his mom and dad
Yeah, yeah.
in the early 80s. And, I'd call up and Mrs. Van Halen would answer the phone and we'd chat and she'd give Eddie the messages.
How was she? How was she to talk to?
She was a sweet lady. She wanted Eddie and Alex to go to DeVries University and become lawyers or accountants because she didn't believe in the music thing. But their dad, Jan, was like totally behind them being musicians. And Jan won that battle.
Yeah, Eddie talks about that later in the interview. Some of the most revealing stuff is about his family, his brother. At the end, especially in the last that 5-hour interview you had at the end, he talks a lot in detail about his father's and his mother's differences about the music situation, and all that, and how there was a lot of mom wanted them to be in a safer profession, even when they were doing pretty well. She was still like, this is not going to last.
It's funny, Jeff. On the way home from that day-long 1980 interview, Eddie and I were in his 4-wheel drive, and I didn't have my recorder on at the time, but two things came out. One, he thought that at the most he had a year or two more in the spotlight. Thank God he was wrong about that, huh?
Sure, right.
And the other shocking thing to me was he borrowed $5 off me to buy some cigarettes, and then we compared how much money we made in the past year.
Oh, yeah.
And as an assistant editor at Guitar Player magazine, I made more money than Eddie Van Halen did headlining stadiums. And I'm like, Eddie, what the hell's going on? You're writing all the music, you got 2 or 3 platinum albums and you don't have any money?
Mm-hmm.
He goes, well, all I know is I never, they say we have it, but they put everything back into lights and trucks and rigs and stuff. The only thing I know is I never see any of it. And I'm like, yeah, well, welcome to rock and roll.
Right. They apparently got that rectified over some time there with management and so on, but they got the contracts, renegotiated and straightened out to where they'd make some money, and they did eventually make some money. But yeah, those first few years they were he didn't see anything. Yeah, right. It was insane. Yeah, that's crazy. So one of the things he talks about, a couple of things he talks about in that interview, in that first interview, is that number one, he's talking at that point, and this is July 23rd, 1978. He's talking to Templeman already about Van Halen 2. They're already planning Van Halen 2 only, halfway through the year there. And he talks about, this is the particular trip when he comes back from Japan, they've lost his gear and he has to play this whole show on rented gear.
Oh yeah, that was a show in Texas, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he lost his Marshalls and all that, And
he used to go fuck Pan Am.
Exactly.
But he told me that the amps ended up in India, and he got them back eventually.
Yeah, his old Marshall. In fact, just before I came on here with you today, Wolfgang just put out a new song, and that song features the original Marshall and the original cabinet from those tours. That original. It just hit today or yesterday. Really, and it sounds amazing. It sounds so amazing still. Yeah, that's crazy. Now, one of the things that I've been chasing for a long time, the destroyer that he used, the Shark, the one that you saw. How did you, when you saw this white and black guitar that apparently the gear was pulled off stage and now you can get to it, did you see the Shark?
No, Eddie took me to his trailer and showed me all of his guitars. The photograph of the two of us, there's two of them. Mm-hmm. That was taken in front of his equipment trailer.
Okay.
But to be honest, I don't remember.
Okay, so it probably got put up by then, but you got to see that.
Oddly enough, Jeff, I've never been that into gear.
Okay.
For me, it's always about the personality of the musician, how they're creative, how they write songs, how they conceive solos and things like that. I was never a hardcore gear junkie.
Gotcha. So what I found really funny about Eddie is that as soon as he started getting, like 79, I think this was the interview, he started lobbying to be on the cover. I thought this was really cool. He said it was would be a dream come true of his to be on the cover. And later he lobbies for you to help him with his brother to be in the drum magazine that would come out later. I guess is that Modern Drummer or is that something else?
That was called Drums and Drumming at the time.
Okay. Yeah, so he was lobbying to get his brother in there, and the way he talks about his brother is so it's endearing, and his
Eddie was unabashed in expressing his love for Alex and his mother and father, especially his father.
yeah,
Eddie said, "Hey, I love my parents. They busted their ass for me. I'll do anything for them." And those two brothers bought the folks a house and a boat, and they retired Jan from. He was a dishwasher
yeah,
at a hospital, I think, or a hotel or something.
hospital.
He used to have to walk to work to save bus fare.
Yeah, I was aware of a lot of that because his father injured his hand. You know that probably that his
He
dad.
lost his finger.
Yeah, and in the backyard back there, and that kind of put him in a situation. But yeah, man, one thing about Eddie I've been trying to bring out is his personality, and you got to see that for a long time. The change from 78 as he's coming up, you're catching all this in your interviews, the changes from 78 through 80 and on. How do you feel that because he talks about his fame and how that's growing and how frustrating he's getting frustrated about the different aspects of fame. How did you see that?
Can I be perfectly candid?
Sure.
As great a musician as Eddie was, I always felt like he may have chosen the wrong line of work.
Right.
Let me tell you what I mean.
Right.
Eddie Van Halen could well have been the most sensitive man I've ever met. Mm-hmm. Beneath the surface, as even by 1980, he was anesthetizing himself with lots of cocaine, mm-hmm. and then later on alcohol and things like that, because it was difficult for him to handle the trappings of stardom. I think Eddie would have been happier if he hadn't been under the intense pressure of having to write every note that Van Halen played, of having to negotiate all these deals to go after people who are ripping off his trademark guitar looks and things like that. I just think like he was so sensitive as a human being. I remember one time that Al was going through a rough breakup with a woman, and Eddie had tears in his eyes as he was explaining it to me and how upset he was about it and how he wished he could do anything to help his brother feel better.
Right.
And I just thought, what an extraordinary guy, Eddie was one of these people like Jimi Hendrix and Eric Johnson and Stevie Ray Vaughan, who were so intensely devoted to their instrument. And then the things that took Eddie away from that, I think, had a negative impact on him. And I think the stress with Dave really was heavy for him to handle.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I used to write up the guitar player readers poll every year, and Eddie Van Halen won a readers poll for best overall guitarist one year. It must have been 1980, or I think might have been 1980 or 81. Anyways, when the results were tabulated, I saw that Eddie had won, and I knew that was a big deal. So I reached out and called him at the hotel where he was on the road. And I didn't know this till later, but when I called him on the phone to tell him, he was in the room with Valerie Bertinelli, and he and Val had just gotten together. And later on, there was an interview with Val in a magazine called Interview out of New York. And she told the story in there about how the interviewer said, "What do you remember the moment you fell in love with Eddie?" And she said, "Yeah, I do." And she goes, "Tell me about it." And Val said, "Well, his friend from Guitar Player called him up to tell him he won the poll. And at that time, there was a lot of tension with Dave. And when he got off the phone, he was really upset. And he says, 'Why does all the good stuff have to happen to me?' Because he was afraid of the blowback from Dave."
Right.
And he started to cry. Yeah. And then as he was crying, he looked up at Valerie and said, "I really love you." And that was the first time he ever said that to her, apparently. And that's when she knew he was the guy. And someone recently gave me Valerie's autobiography, and she references that in that book as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I always, even later, all the trouble that he had along the way, with that. I always, I mean, I guess back then we didn't think about anxiety and those issues. People just did the things that you discussed to deal with it. But, we didn't, I guess as we gotten further down the road and that became something we understood as a culture better, that people, especially like me, because that runs in my family, I immediately could recognize what was going on with him behind all of this, the pressure,
Yeah.
the issues with that, and I recently said this on something I posted about how Eddie made so much time for his fans. He would stop for anybody, and he always had to pose, for pictures, and he would always flash that trademark smile. That happened for me with Eddie, and there's just how many people that he had to do that for. How many years, did he have to put on that brave face for their fans, all the time.
I wrote a book with Jimi Hendrix's dad and got to know Al really well. And I wrote another book about Jimi more recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm convinced that what killed Jimi Hendrix was they didn't give him any time off. They didn't give him any time to decompress.
Mm-hmm.
That guy needed 6 months off to go off into the desert or go off by himself and relax. And they just endless pressure on him. And I think Eddie experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, back then we didn't recognize it so much, but now like people are more aware of that, and so the way you would deal with it is to anesthetize yourself with drugs.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I always had a sensitive spot for him because I always felt like some people had said things like everybody has a bad day and everybody has bad moments in their lives, and well, unfortunately when you're Eddie Van Halen that gets put out on the whole news wire, and it's just a big mess. But yeah, I always felt like, this guy was pure at heart. Like you knew him, you knew how he was and what you're describing, his personality.
Yeah.
Sensitivity.
Yeah, I agree.
And you
Definitely.
see that in interviews with you, in these, especially towards the end of that last interview where he talks about his family and he gets into these details where things I've never heard, Jas, there's this spot where he talks about these films that he has, Super 8 films of himself his dad took at the piano recitals, right? And then there was another one apparently when they're getting off the boat, and then another one
no, it's when the other one is Eddie and Alex leaving for America.
Okay, from getting on.
So it's like the last footage of the little Van Halen brothers leaving Holland. Wow. And waving to the camera. Boy, I hope these things still exist and someday we get to see them.
He said that, over the years he mentioned, I heard that before, and I had read your interview so long ago that to go back through this was really cool, to get these little details again. And but I also heard that he said somewhere that he had not only these piano competitions, but he had like school talent shows and stuff of him playing guitar back then on video as well. So there's apparently other stuff.
Wow. Here's hoping that Wolfgang or Alex or somebody has archived it and share it someday.
That's amazing. I just that whole end of that last interview, he talks about his brother, and you were talking about that, and he's talking about his brother's ability to build these drum sets and the way he artistically creates them and all the different aspects. He's talking about the new kit that he's fixing to go on tour with in 80. It's so cool how much he loved his brother and how much he just he said he was so smart. He was like, my brother is so smart. He's just like, just.
He didn't have to go to class. He would just show up and take tests and ace them.
yeah, Eddie. He was like, that's not me, but my brother. It is so easy for him. But he didn't he didn't feel like he was at all jealous of his brother or anything like. I know they fought, but
well, you got a brother when you fight. That's the way of the world. Right. Both of my brothers have scars that I've given them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I have a sister, so we did the same thing. That's crazy. So you were in Zlozauer's place when you did this.
Yeah. I can tell you something funny that happened that I didn't put in the interview.
Sure.
Um, Actually, there's one more piece of interview, hour 6, that we're going to post in a week or two, where Eddie plays back. He has like the rough mixes of Women and Children First,
Right.
and he brought a cassette and a little ghetto blaster to the interview, and he popped in the cassette and he played the different songs or parts of them. And then he'd stop and he'd talk about it or he'd talk over it. So it's like Eddie previewing the rough mixes of what finally came out as Women and Children First. But we held off on that one till the very end because we had to clear the copyright issues on it. Anyways, during that 7 or 8 hours we spent together, Eddie says, he asked me if I wanted to get high. Now, I'd been smoking pot at that time for 35 or 40 years already. So no, I mean, wait a minute, I was 25. I had been smoking pot since I was 15. So yeah, I was like, yeah, okay. And so I reached in my pocket to pull out a joint. And then he goes, no, I got some. And Neil like did a turnaround. He was surprised because Eddie, I never knew of you smoking. He goes, I can't do it. I don't know how Dave does it all the time. Anyways, so Eddie pulls out his wallet, Jeff. And you know how these wallets used to have these plastic insert things where you put the cards in?
Sure. Yeah.
In his wallet, he has two things: a driver's license and 2/3 of a smoked joint. And they're right next to each other in these plastic inserts, right? And so we take a few hits off Eddie's joint or whatever, and he puts the rest of it into the thing. And I swear that guy got looped. I mean, he was like rolling around for a few minutes, like a drunk, you know. It was really.
Wow.
And then Neil and I both were like taken aback. And Eddie goes, I don't know how Dave does it, you know. I just can't smoke. Anyways, later on, as I talked about in the interview on the YouTube posting, Eddie's driving me back to the airport in his 4-wheel drive, and we're stuck in traffic. And he goes, hang on, man. And he wheels us off up the curb and he speeds off down all these people's lawns and jumps off the curb on the cross street and takes off. And I'm thinking to myself, if we get pulled over, the cop is going to see that roach and a driver's license, and we're both going to get locked up because back then it was a big time offense.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But you know, looking back at it, if I am going to go to jail, you know, who better to get locked up with me? Actually, I think that Steve Vai told me he met Dave in jail. We were both being held in the same holding area and started talking.
I never heard that story.
Yeah, I'll post that interview at some point.
Oh wow, wow, that's crazy, man. That's so amazing. Now you said you went on to. Well, I knew you interviewed Michael Anthony in '81.
Yeah,
and in that interview, I listened to that one as well, and that was interesting to listen to and go through that with Mike. So, what other interviews past 80 and 81?
Let me talk about the big ones.
Sure, go ahead.
In 1982, Eddie called me up and we did an interview on Diver Down. And, you know, I did maybe 800 interviews for Guitar Player Magazine, Rolling Stone, Living Blues, all these publications. And only one of my interviews tapes has ever been stolen and leaked. And that was the Diver Down interview. And that went on on YouTube, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So if you listen to that one, that's the one where Eddie has just bought a Wurlitzer organ and he's like en route to Lexington, Kentucky, calls me up in the middle of the night and he says, hey, I've written a song on this organ I just bought. And he starts riffing, and in the process of riffing, he plays the beginning of Jump. So he had Jump. You know, I didn't know it at the time, but years later, someone who listened to that interview came up and goes, he's holding the cassette tape and he goes, do you know what's on this tape? I go, yes, an interview with Eddie Van Halen, right? Do you remember him playing music for you? I go, yeah, damn it, man. The guy wakes me up at 2 a.m. to play me organ concert, you know.
Right.
He goes, he plays you Jump 2 years before it came out. And I was like, really? And I listened back and there it was.
Yeah.
But, so that was one. Okay. So that one's been on YouTube for a long time. So I'm not going to repost it. It's already up there. But then in 1987, I had a really interesting day with Eddie and Sammy and Val. So so we did 2, maybe 3 or 4 hours of interviews. I did one of the two of them alone. It might have been Sammy or Ed. And then I did the two of them together. And it's during that interview where Eddie confesses that he's played a lot of the bass parts on the Van Halen albums, that he always shows Mike what to play.
Mhm.
Sammy talks about how Eddie influenced his songwriting, vice versa. Eddie talks about actually playing on the Sammy Hagar solo album that had just come out
Right.
and things like that. So,
Playing bass though, right? He played bass on that album.
right.
Right.
And I think he may have played one note on guitar. It's been a long time.
Well, yeah. Then the other thing is that cover is the one where Eddie has the bass and Sammy's in the cover, right?
Yeah, Sammy's up in the air, he's airborne. He's
Yeah.
jumping up.
Yeah.
And so, and Val was there, and that was an interesting day because two things I remember vividly. One was I was standing off to the side, and I was looking at Valerie, and she was looking at Eddie and Sammy as they were walking away, right? And she didn't know anyone was watching her. And I vividly remember that she looked at him with such love. You know, the Italian women have this beautiful way of expressing love for the family.
Mhm.
And that was like written all over her face as she watched Eddie. And I thought, what a lucky guy Eddie is to have this person in his life.
Mhm.
And the other thing was that Valerie came up and said that when he did the 1980 cover of Guitar Player magazine with Eddie, that's right around the time we met. And I tore that cover off and framed it, and it's hanging up in my office. Can you send me a copy of the magazine that still has the cover on it? I said, sure, man, I'll be glad to. And I did.
Oh.
And then the other big interview was 1991. And by now, Eddie's on a pretty steep decline,
Mhm.
emotionally, physically. And this one took place at his home studio. Did he call that 5150?
He did, yeah.
Yeah, he was living up in a canyon, and
Mhm.
he had a big main house. And then he'd take a golf cart up the hill to a studio he had built. And he was especially proud that they had installed a urinal in there so the guys could piss in the urinal, and he showed me the urinal. I thought, hey, man, thanks. Anyways, for that interview, he was working on an album called For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge.
Right.
So for that interview, he plays me different tracks and then he talks over them or he talks about them after they end up playing. And then he took me down to meet his newborn son, Wolfgang. So we went down to the kitchen, which was probably as big as your house. And Valerie was nursing Wolfgang at the time. So there was this kind of uncomfortable moment for me where I didn't know where to look or what to do. But here was me and Eddie and Val, and I got to meet Wolfgang when he was like this big, just a little baby.
Wow.
But Eddie was like so happy to have that boy.
Yeah. He loves his son.
Oh yeah. Well, Van Halen was like extremely family oriented. As long as I knew him, family was number one. He thought of the band Van Halen as his family.
Yeah.
And when Dave did that solo album to Eddie, that was like a betrayal of the family, I think.
Yeah. It crushed him and it crushed everybody else too. It crushed me. I remember when I was just becoming a really big Van Halen fan and that all happened and it was over. And I was just so, like, gosh, I didn't even get to, really, I saw 84 and then it was over, I barely even got into it, and I was like, oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Heartbreaking at that time. I remember specifically that I was a teen and it just crushed me. I was like, oh man.
And Dave thought it would be the end of the band, and then Van Halen went on to their best-selling album after with Sammy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wasn't 5150 the big one?
Yeah, right after it, yeah. 86.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 86. Yeah, I mean they did. It was a rare transition like maybe AC/DC did, really the only few people who've ever made that transition where they had a second singer come in that was just as successful or more successful than the one before.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing feat and a totally different vibe. How did you feel about Sammy era music?
To be honest, Jeff, my go-to Van Halen album is always the first one
Yeah.
because that's the birth energy of Van Halen. If you think about the arc of rock guitar, right?
Hmm.
At the very beginning, you have people like Chuck Berry, and it's only like a 12-year difference from Chuck Berry playing Johnny Be Good to Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock.
Sure.
That's an astounding leap in the way people perceive an instrument and what they do with it. I mean, it's just like I can't think of any kind of musical instrument from another era that had underwent such sweeping changes in so short a period. And then I think from the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, it's 9 years to Eruption. So this is like rock guitar is only at like 20 some years old at that moment. And it's Eddie's contributions are to me are just as vast as the other people we've been talking about.
Oh yeah.
And very few people have that kind of an impact.
Yeah, I agree. That was one of the reasons why I do this is so that we can archive, these stories and his impact. I mean, over the generations of people. I mean, it just blew me away. That's why I'm here.
After the first album by Van Halen, I couldn't go to a party that had a live band, go to a music store, walk around the NAMM floor without hearing these pale imitations of Eruption or people doing that finger tapping not nearly as well as Eddie. I mean, he changed the technique.
Yeah, he did. That was one of the amazing things about the tapping that comes up in your first interview was that he talks about, and this is something that was always lore, but the lore, he actually uncovers the lore in your interview, which I don't know why we've all missed it because I guess it's just been a long time, but he talks about turning his back to the audience and why he did that. That original issue with Angel, and you really got me almost getting lifted, was why he said not because of the kids, but because of what happened, because he was open about this, letting friends hear it. Because I've heard the other people that were there who were friends of his that got copies. That they're like sworn, you ever let this out, you die, kind of stuff. Because of what happened, it was so they were very protective, and I think that the way I understood what he said. Now maybe you interpret different. He said that he started doing the turning his back after the Angel thing. I don't know if that's true though, because that would have been after the club days. So maybe he was doing it before.
But I don't think Eddie needed to worry about that because he was so fleet and accurate and interesting and
right.
melodic on a guitar that no one could just rip that off.
Right. And he was quick. Apparently, all the friends around him, said that when he got a hold of this technique, that it just became part of his playing really quickly within a year. From all we know, I think there was a point where he had some time between the signing and the release, and they were working. Dave was working on his vocals. Eddie was working on some of these things that we know from the first album. It all seemed to happen within a very short period of time from what you saw in the clubs. Now, maybe they were hiding it or something, but there was a period.
Yeah,
there was a short period there.
Eruption was not planned to be on the album. Eddie used it as like a warm up and a stage solo, I guess, before that. But Ted heard him doing it, as he was warming up, and said, "Hey, let's put that on the record."
Yeah, if you listen to Bootleg, it's not like, it's not just like anything he did live. It was like a one-off. You've never heard that exact rendition anywhere online. You've heard, pieces of it, parts of it, the gist of it, but yeah, it's sort of a one-off, one-take wonder, right?
Yeah,
so that's amazing.
I don't know.
That's amazing. Your story going to that show just blew me away. How was that day? Was it really hot? What was it like?
It was hot. I remember Eddie was real sweaty from playing basketball.
Yeah, all right.
He was shining.
Let let me ask you about Bill Graham, because nobody talks about Bill Graham. Because
Sure.
from a historical standpoint, I know that he was important to Noel Monk, who was their manager, who I knew a little bit. And a lot of people talk about Bill, and I know that he passed away in a helicopter crash. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. He was fairly young at this point himself in '78.
Yeah, he would have been. Well, Bill Graham's and his sister escaped the Nazi Holocaust
Okay.
by crossing over a mountain or something like that. So he was a kid in the early 40s, which would have made him 10 years or 15 years older than I am.
Yeah, that's
And
why
then he,
pictures I've seen of him. There's a picture that Neil took of him with Van Halen at that show, and I'm thinking he's 35, 40 maybe.
yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
But Bill had like extraordinary taste in music, and Bill was super instrumental in hipping rock audiences to other kinds of music. You know, he would have like the Grateful Dead play, but he'd have that great British band Pentangle open for them. Or he'd have Miles Davis open for, some big rock band or whatever. And he was a really brilliant, insightful guy, a very good listener. And he had an interesting quality. Carlos Santana told me a story about a dealing he had with Bill where he went to see Bill in his office. And Bill was like on the phone with somebody, and he's like, "You goddamn motherfucker. Goddamn." And then he's like, "Just a minute, Carlos. You goddamn oh, you better." Like, "Hi, Carlos, what's going on?" It's like nothing had happened. So he had that ability to channel himself in this beautiful way. I always admired Bill.
Yeah, I've heard great things about him.
He was I remember talking with him about his all-time favorite album, and for him it was Miles Davis, Sketches of Spain. But he would talk to anybody. He was just a regular kind of guy, but you didn't want to mess with him because he didn't suffer fools gladly. I remember that when Cream came to play the Fillmore, the guy who ran Cream's record company came along and demanded that he and his sister or somebody he was with be given chairs at the side of the stage and all that. And Graham threw him out of the venue. The owner of the record label. And so then he went backstage to Clapton and Jack Bruce, and he said, "Hey, I don't know if you guys are going to want to play or not, but I just like threw your manager out of the venue." And they were delighted. So Graham was an interesting character. I know Carlos, who I worked with, knew Graham really well, and he loved the guy. He just thought the world of him.
Wow, wow, yeah,
I don't have any complaints about Bill Graham.
yeah. I've always heard, because it's just that's a generation before me, but I've heard a lot of stories, and I was wondering what you thought. Yeah, amazing, amazing stuff. You know what? As I was going through your new interviews too, I picked up that this is something that Van Halen people might be interested in because we're all quarter guitar maniacs. And Yngwie's interviews that you did were around, early '80s interviews with Yngwie, or really the kind of early, maybe the first ones of those, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
I think so.
Yeah, it was interesting to again, like with Eddie, you caught him at this moment, like right before he gets all this fame. He's just starting to get notoriety. So his impression of it there, and then '79 and '80, you see how he changes a little bit, how the pressure starts to build.
Well, see, you got to remember to get to the level of skill that guys like Eddie and Yngwie have, you have to sacrifice. You really do. You have to, in a way, you have to throw away your influences and make a journey inward and find that which is uniquely you and your music and focus on that. And you have to spend endless amount of time practicing. Eddie and Eric Johnson and these different people have all told me, when I was in grade school and high school, and I just came home after school and sat on my bed and I played all afternoon and evening. And I didn't go to parties. I played. And so back then, the Guitar Player magazine, in a way, was one of the best ways to get information on other guitarists because nobody was asking people nobody else was asking people like, what kind of picks do you use and why? How do you make a Strat guitar? How do you make a Strat stay in tune when you're whamming a lot and all this kind of stuff? And so the players read our magazine. And so Yngwie, when he's little Yngwie living over in Malmo, Sweden, he's reading Guitar Player magazine. And so on the night I met him, Alcatraz was supposed to play at Wolfgang's in San Francisco. It was one of their very first gigs. And Graham Bonnet was sick. And so Yngwie used a couple of musicians from another band and came out and played a set by himself. And then afterwards, it was kind of like pandemonium backstage. And Yngwie comes walking out after a while and he sees me and makes a beeline to me. And he goes, "Jas Obrecht, I learned English to read your interviews in Guitar Player magazine." And I looked at John Sievert, my friend, the photographer, like, bullshit. Yeah, sure. And Yngwie's like, "No bullshit, man. BB King issue, page 132 or whatever. You're in the T-shirt ad, right?" And I was. This guy knew the magazine inside and out. So what would happen, Jeff, is hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, sent me demos over the years. And so I got to hear people before they got famous and do their first interviews. And if I think about it, I did the first nationally published cover stories with Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Eddie Van Halen. Buckethead, when he was a teenager, came to Guitar Player magazine to drop off a demo tape that he had just made, and he ended up living with me for 6 or 8 months after that. So these people would seek us out and ask us to interview him. And I was forever known as the guy who interviewed Eddie Van Halen. So after that, the up and coming players in that genre were asking me to do interviews with them.
Sure.
So all the people at Shrapnel Records and guys like George Lynch, who I think is a really good player, and Vinnie Moore and people like that were like, "Hey, I want to interview with Jas," So I became known as the go-to guy for those kind of
players.
Groundbreaking guitar interviews.
That's amazing. One of the things I wanted to ask you about cover stories and Eddie Van Halen's cover stories is that, okay, you get this interview in 78, but it takes to 80 before you hit him on the cover. He in the interview is like, "What is it? Why does everybody hate?" Why does everybody hate me?
Typical Eddie.
And you're like going, we kind of do it this way. Why was it that you did it like 3 years, or 2 years later?
Because you only publish 12 cover stories a year.
Okay.
Right? 1 second. I'm going to grab. You're doing 12 cover stories a year. Okay. Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top, Hank Garland, a country guy. We got to do all the different genres. Yeah. Jeff Baxter, studio guy with the Doobie Brothers and Steely Dan. John Williams, a classical composer for films. Jeff Beck, BB King. So we have to cover all the different genres of guitar. And we only get 12 cover stories a year. So what typically, the rule when I got to Guitar Player was, you do an interview with somebody, a feature article, then you wait 2 or 3 years before you do a cover story, if they get a cover story. And so that's what happened. Now, Eddie was like such a superior musician and making such a splash that when he asked me to do a cover story with him, I went in and talked my editor at the time into letting me do it. And so a couple of weeks later, I was in Hollywood doing the interview, but Eddie knew what he wanted, and he was a persistent guy.
I remember when he said, he was saying that he wanted to be on the cover. It'd be a dream come true or whatever.
And he's like, "Why is Pat Travers on the cover?"
Right, because you were talking about Pat Travers, right? So
God forbid Eddie had a grudge about you, boy. He could be unrelenting.
Well, he mentioned how mad he would get. He says that. I can.
He was mad at Nugent. He's mad at Tom Schultz. He's mad at Joe Perry. He's mad at all these
right.
Don't even get me started on Rick Springfield.
Rick Springfield.
But if you treated Eddie like a dick, as he would say, he found it hard to let go.
Yeah, he said that.
Like I said, he was super sensitive.
Yeah, he said that in that interview. He said, I just hate when people are nice and then they do something, mean to me like that, and they're not nice. And yeah, those stories about him and all those people that he met, even Clapton, how that didn't go as well as you hoped at one point, early on, I think it was. But yeah, that's wild. That whole his wanting to be on the cover, and then you say, okay, I think we can get it in this particular part of, I think you said a year, but it was actually in January that you managed to do it earlier. Didn't you?
I had a lot of pull at the magazine. Thankfully, I was one of the two or three main interviewers. So, the 20 years I worked there, 95% of what I wrote were articles that I proposed and wanted to do. I had complete freedom. Yeah. It's not like, Jas, we want you to interview Survivor, and then we want you to interview Foreigner, and then it was never like that. I'd come in and I'd say, what, I like the new ZZ Top album, and Luther Allison's got a great album coming out, and I'd like to do a historic piece on Nick Lucas or whatever. And they would just give me carte blanche, which is extraordinarily rare in music journalism. Right. But I saw myself as a musicologist, and I still do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you go back. Did you see Hendrix when you were younger?
No, I was too young. I missed Jimmy. Yeah. He died when I was like 17.
Yeah, Satriani points to that date, his death, and so does Yngwie, as their kind of like moment where they woke up to guitar.
And Joe Satriani told me that the day he heard on the radio that Jimmy had died is the day he decided he had to become a guitar player.
So did Yngwie. I guess you knew that, though. You probably say that.
Yeah.
In the interview. Yeah, both of those guys were so influenced by Hendrix, and I was a little late to Hendrix myself. I was coming in and guitar playing just after like 80s, where I really started to be exposed to music or rock music. So I was kind of on the back side of that.
Jimi Hendrix was so fresh, exciting, and different when he came out with Are You Experienced, that first album. Like Foxy Lady and Purple Haze became hits, and we never heard anything like that. It was as fresh as can be. And then he did that Electric Ladyland album with All Along the Watchtower, which is my all-time favorite recording ever. I never ever get tired of hearing that. Jimmy just had this wonderful imagination and an ability to orchestrate music in a way that hadn't been done before. I mean, think of what he accomplished in 3 years. It's astounding.
It is astounding. And when I think about when Eddie says
Eddie wasn't into Jimmy.
Yeah, he says that, and but the lineage of the feedback, the tone, the overdriven tone, kind of goes to Hendrix, wouldn't you say? I mean,
yeah, I think what Eddie took from Clapton, he always cited Clapton as his main influence. I think what he took there was phrasing and ways of assembling solos, and at some point during the 1980 interview, he starts playing Crossroads and different Clapton stuff to show that, he memorized this. With Jimmy, it was more difficult to memorize and get it because there was so much sound sculpting going on. It wasn't just plugging a guitar into an amp and blowing the way Eric did,
Yeah, there's a lot of
Eddie. What's that?
There's a lot.
Eddie didn't have like all the fancy pedals and things like that. He didn't have the money to buy them.
Right. There's a lot of playing on your interview. He plays a lot and unplugged, which is really cool to hear his hands and hear. A lot of people talk about it as his attack with his hands. You saw it in person. I mean, he must have had super strong hands.
He did. I always found it interesting how musicians shake hands. Eddie had a really firm, powerful grip. Stevie Ray Vaughan had a vice-like grip. He had the most powerful handshake I've ever had. The weakest handshake I've ever had was from Muddy Waters, really? Oddly enough. Muddy didn't how you shake hands, and Muddy would grab your fingers and shake the end of your fingertips rather than your whole hand, which struck me as odd. But when he did it to me, but then I've seen photographs of him doing it with his friends and other people. That's just what he did. But Eddie had a lot of life in him and energy, and it came across in the way he shook hands was kind of the way he played guitar and talked, you know.
Yeah. That's I thought it was funny when you said shake hands. I shook hands with Steve Vai one time, and I thought he had the softest hands, and they're huge. They're long.
Oh
And
yeah.
he says this thing at some point. He says, "I willed my hand to be longer," right? And so I ran across the thing with John 5 where he said his left hand was longer than his right because of all the playing he did when he was young. And then that same night, I was put my hands and took a picture of both my hands, and sure enough, my left hand my fingers are longer.
Oh my God, you're right.
They are.
The biggest hands in the history of the guitar. That award has to go to a jazz guy named Tal Farlow.
Oh yeah.
Look at a picture of his hands. Unbelievable.
Wow.
He could make stretches that, you know, nobody else could do, which is one of his unique qualities. And he worked as a professional sign painter
Okay.
in addition to being a guitar player. He like specialized in writing names on boats, painting names on boats and stuff like that.
Wow. Yeah, I'm always fascinated with the hands. You know, when you look at Eddie's hands in the cast at Guitar Center, they're not particularly long, whereas Yngwie's are super long, and so are Steve Vai's. It's just interesting that their physical makeup. With Eddie, I think it was the piano that gave him all the strength, maybe, you know, as a kid.
Yeah. Angus Young had the smallest hands I've seen
Really?
on a you know leading rock guitar player. And when I looked at his hand, I said, how are you able to do all those stretches? And he put his hand up, and he had the ability to make his index and his little fingers splay out much further than the average person. It was fascinating to see that.
That is wild. Yeah, always
Mhm.
interesting. I have a friend who played with Alice Cooper, and my wife and I always talk about he has guitar playing fingers. They're long, skinny fingers, you know, just like perfectly made for guitar playing.
Mhm.
It's amazing, but not exclusive. You know, when you think about, like you said, Angus Young, he just something about their makeup and everything. It's a wild.
And there's something, like you look at someone like Django Reinhardt, the great gypsy jazz guitarist.
Yep.
He was in a caravan fire that fused two of his fingers together permanently on his fretting hand, and yet he overcame that to not only play with a great amount of speed, but beautiful articulation and wonderful melodies would spool out of him. Some of these musicians that are just not limited by physical things like that. They
Yeah,
have a way of overriding them.
it's interesting. I always thought like Gary Moore. You know, Gary Moore was he was left-handed, but he played right-handed, and I thought, well,
Steve Morse is like that too.
does it give them an advantage? You know, having their favored hand on the fretboard.
Yeah, I kind of wish I'd thought about that when I was first starting out.
Yeah, right. Because are you left-handed?
No,
Okay. I got
well, I play regular guitars, but I wondered if I would play differently if my right hand was my fretting hand.
right. Because it would affect. Yeah, it would definitely affect that. One of the things that Eddie did in your interviews is he played a song that became a song called "Big River" on Different Kind of Truth in 2012. There's a section where he plays most of this song in your tape. That we knew he took some of these older ideas, but I know I recognized it in your recording. The whole song's there back in, I think it's 1980s when he did this. At
Mhm.
that particular interview, he plays pretty much the whole song.
Yeah,
Hear it.
gotta love it. Well, Jeff, you've been playing since 1980, you said?
I've been playing since I started playing in 1983.
Don't you sometimes find yourself going back to some of the earliest stuff you played, especially if you pick up a guitar you had back then?
Sure.
And you work it into something today, or you recycle it some way. And it doesn't surprise me at all about Ed.
Yeah, it was always cool that he would bring these ideas that he had, even like from 78 he brought them forward a couple of years. They would be 2 or 3 years, or 84 had ideas from the earlier days. He carried those and then carried on even further. I think maybe with Sammy it was less of that, but yeah, definitely different kind of truth. He brought some stuff.
Has anyone ever put out Eddie told me when they did the first Van Halen album, they like recorded a lot of extra songs.
They did, but that demo that has they did them all in one day apparently at Sunset.
Has that demo been made public?
Not yet, no,
I'd
no, but
love to hear that just to see what we like where he's coming from.
yeah, right. There was a whole day. Now there may be a bootleg of that out there. I think there is actually a bootleg of that out there, but I don't think they've officially released that.
In retrospect, I should have asked him for a copy.
Right, right. There was a attempt to put a live bootleg out officially at one point. One of the guys that was been on here had it as a pristine tape that they ended up getting and then trying to mix, and they didn't end up putting it out, but they ended up putting out the Tokyo thing instead. So they put that out. But yeah,
I think at one point, Ed and I talked about the Van Halen bootlegs.
What do you say?
I don't remember it, but it's in the 1980 interview, I think.
Okay. Yeah,
somewhere or other.
He did talk about it in there. Yeah, he talked about that, and he was talking about how he didn't like because the quality was so bad. He didn't like
that. Was it. Yeah, he didn't like the quality of it. It didn't bother him. It was bootleg. He didn't like the quality. Nowadays people go to concerts and hold up their cell phone and bring home a souvenir of the whole show. From that perspective, it's hard to imagine 40 years ago where nobody could record anything at a concert and they were very guarded about it.
Yeah, well, there is one recording that's 78 that's pretty clean that's out there, video. There's a couple other pieces that have been out there that people have rematched audio to of them in their 78 tour. But there's also rumors of that 81 tour that everybody, the videos that came out from in Oakland, everybody thinks there's a full version of that somewhere.
I was at that show.
Were you?
So there's a young lady who crowd surfs in it, and she's the daughter of somebody I worked with. So I actually know the person in that video who's being like shuffled around by the stage.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in the video. I have to go back and watch that. But the whole reason I play guitar is because I saw that video, Unchained, and I think maybe, guys, it was because Drop D. I never heard that, and it's something about when I heard that low note, it just caught my attention, and then that video, of course, was like, wow, I was like, what is this? And it was.
Don't you wish Eddie had done an acoustic album?
Yeah, it'd been cool.
I'd be so curious to hear what he would come up with.
Yeah, well, Van Halen 3, he did a little bit of acoustic work on that.
Yeah,
you're familiar with that. Yeah, and that's one of those things I talked to Chris Gill about, from Guitar World, that Chris had a perspective on that we all should go back and listen to it and try to ignore the vocals.
Why don't they just like strip the vocals out and re-release it?
They should. I had this idea, like, wouldn't it be great music for the biopic? Like, this music's not as well known, but it was him, it'd be something awesome to have.
Oh yeah.
More of as an accentuating piece to a documentary or a movie, or still his material, not as well known, but still really interesting to listen to. There's a couple instrumentals on that, like that are just long pieces that are really cool, and acoustic a little bit here and there. Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, man. It's crazy. So, to close it out, let's talk about, the last time you talked to him was 91. Is that right?
That's the last time we hung out for a day together. Yeah.
Yeah. So, his legacy and kind of going back, you saw it all the way from the beginning. So this is such a unique thing that you experienced in your life, and then his passing. I mean, it seemed way too, I still can't believe he's gone. I mean, I don't know how you felt about it, but.
Jeff, I'm at the age where, I have a phone. I have these handwritten address books from when I worked at Guitar Player, and etc. and I flip through it sometimes, and I'm astounded by not only like how many famous people gave me their phone numbers and home addresses and stuff, but how many of them have passed away. So I'm 70 now, so I'm at the age where I know a lot of people who've passed away, and so I'm not surprised that Eddie died, because I'm used to people dying. I hate to say it, And gee, I really hope to outlive everybody I know.
I know.
and stay and stay lucid, except for my wife and daughter, of course. Um, I'm sorry he's gone, but I feel so lucky that he's left behind so much fantastic music and inspiration. And certain musicians never age. When I put this record on, it's like hearing it for the first time all over again. I feel that when I listen to, Jimi Hendrix's "Are You Experienced?" I feel it with several other records. There's just this timeless quality that transcends everything that's happened since then, and still stands alone and as Eddie says, can raise the hair on your arms.
Yeah. Well,
He liked to say that about music that he liked.
that's funny you said that because that's exactly what happened to me when I heard him. That time I saw the video, it my everything raised, and I was just so affected by that moment and that music that I'm here with you.
Here's a question for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
In the interview I did with Eddie and Sammy together,
Yeah.
I asked both of them if you could somehow transcend time and go back and see any historic musician, who would you want to see?
Oh, of course, Eddie.
Who do you think Eddie picked?
Eddie would. He said his dad though. Remember, he said that in the Smithsonian. But what did he tell you?
Mozart.
Oh yeah, he said that.
How many other rock players would say that? With Ingve, it'd be Bach,
Right, right.
Johann Sebastian. But with Eddie, it was Mozart, and which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, if I didn't pick Eddie, I'd pick Hendrix because of the impact that he had, and because I think Hendrix was something you had to, like a lot of people, be in the presence of to really get his impact.
I'm mostly known for writing about blues musicians, but people are surprised when I've been asked that question. If I could go back and see any musician,
And,
I'd like to be there when Bob Marley wrote "No Woman, No Cry."
oh wow, yeah,
That's what I do. I'd want to witness him sitting on his bed, his single bed, in his little place down in Trenchtown, strumming a guitar and writing that song.
yeah, it's amazing.
Mhm.
That's he came to mind when a couple of years ago I was interested in that studio down in the Bahamas, Compass Point, where a lot of this, they did a lot of great historic music there, a lot of recordings, and
Oh, yeah.
I got interested in that particular place. Unfortunately, it's kind of lost. They basically turned it into offices and it's no longer there. But we have a place here in North Alabama called Muscle Shoals Sound, which is a very famous studio that's still been refurbished.
I interviewed all the guys there.
Yeah, David Hood and all those guys.
David Hood, Jimmy Johnson. I did a cover story on Dwayne Allman.
Yep.
So I interviewed the Muscle Shoals rhythm section talking about when Dwayne came down there in that milk truck or whatever it was and
Yep.
blew their minds with how well he played. Wouldn't you love to have been there when Aretha showed up and started playing piano? Oh my God.
Tell you what, there's a couple studios. There's two. There's a few studios in town. One was the one where it wasn't Fame and it wasn't Muscle Shoals Sound. It was a different one where they did the When a Man Loves a Woman track.
Oh, Percy Sledge.
Yeah, yeah, and with Spooner Odom, who's still alive, the keyboard
He
player.
is?
Yeah, he's still alive. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I was in a convenience store last week, and a guy saw some music thing on me, and he was like talking to me about Muscle Shoals, and he just delivered some furniture or something to Spooner, and I was like, "Yeah, I know. Spooner's still around, still rocking it, still playing. He still plays on a regular basis live. He's still
Bless his heart.
yeah."
He must be he's in his 80s.
Yeah, yeah. Him and David both still play on a regular basis.
Good.
Yep.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, they're still playing on a
Yeah.
regular. Yeah, I have some friends that we actually play up there quite a bit on weekends, and then I have some friends who are in that group of people up there that do all the songwriters and folks from that area that are kind of like the younger people that are carrying that legacy. They're doing some shows and tributing those people, and some of those people are involved as much as they can be at this point. So it's quite a piece of history that just happened to be up the street from me, and I happened to got the privilege of being in those rooms and being able to know a little bit more.
as this world becomes crazier and more wicked and backward leaning, it seems, isn't it wonderful that we have this music to find solace in?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? And those songs, like you said, Van Halen one, when you hear them, they seem like they were just yesterday.
Uh-huh. You know, Jeff, before we sign off, I just wanted to mention I feel really lucky to have been able to interview so many, musicians who mattered to people. I think I did more than 700 interviews altogether. And I'm going to devote the rest of my time I have here in this life to making the audio of these interviews available to people so they can actually hear what people sound like and the rhythm of their language, the tone of their voice, and things like that. Because very often the way a musician speaks mirrors the way they play and approach an instrument. You can hear elements of it. And so I want to invite your listeners and people who enjoy this podcast to check out the Talking Guitar YouTube channel that I've begun posting some of those interviews on. I've only got a couple dozen up there and hundreds more to go. And the Talking Guitar magazine at Substack, where I have transcriptions and I tell the backstories of interviews and things like that. So you can get more Van Halen material there and other things that you might find interesting.
Yeah, like the audio interviews that when you first posted this first clip of Van Halen in '78 on that first interview, that was so fantastic to hear his voice.
Doesn't he? He's so young and fresh and excited.
I know that's what it's like. And you really in the audio, you really pick that up, that vibe from him. And you.
And for me, that's Eddie. For me, that's Eddie. When I think of Eddie, that's the Eddie I go to.
And you, this is you. Right?
Guilty as charged.
Back then, right? That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. I love it.
People used to confuse me for Jeff Baxter. So one time I'm in a restaurant with Steve Morse and the Dixie Dregs, and I got the long hair and the big mustache, and the busboy comes over and he goes, "Are you Steve Morse?" And Steve goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "Can I have your autograph?" And Steve points at me and goes, "And he's Jeff Baxter." And the guy like turned his back on Steve.
Oh, wow.
Comes over to me to get my autograph.
Wow.
So I dutifully signed it, Jeffrey Baxter, and handed it to him. And he left without getting Steve's autograph.
Wow. That's amazing, man.
It was funny. I'd go to the NAMM show and people would assume I was Jeff Baxter.
That's crazy. Did you ever interview Nuno? Because he's been real hot lately.
No, I didn't. By then, we'd had some new guys like James Rotundi and Chris Gill come on staff at guitar player, and I felt like I could outrank him and take all the interviews I wanted, but I felt like they should have a chance too. So the later Van Halen interviews I gave to Rotundi, and I think Roto might have done the Nuno one as well.
Okay.
And after like 1990, 91, I was more interested in covering the blues musicians and the rockers who had deeper credentials and had been around longer, and I let the younger editors do the younger up and coming players, with some exceptions, of course.
I was going to say Andy Alador. He just did an interview with Nuno, and Nuno talks about Eddie's right hand in there, and he talks about the big G chord in Mean Streets that we all, when we heard it, we're just like, why is his G chord different than ours? And it's the same two notes. But he was talking about the right hand and how important Eddie's right hand was to it. And he got into a lot of detail about, fleshing that out. How do you talk about these techniques? How do you explain it? And that's what your job was, to kind of bring from those guys. And it's pretty cool.
My job was to figure out what their most diehard fans would ask them,
okay,
ones who played guitar, right, and then ask those questions.
Right.
So it took a lot more research than you'd imagine. I just wrote an article and posted it today called "How to Interview Musicians."
Yeah, I saw that.
And in there, I talk about that.
Yeah, I was reading through that. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super. I appreciate it. Huh?
Go ahead. 45 years experience went into that article.
I know, man. And, you know, we're so glad that you came on and shared your stories with us today. And I appreciate your time and everything you did. You know, we all have lived vicariously through you next to Eddie Van Halen for 45 years.
And Jeff, I got to commend you. You're an excellent interviewer.
Thank you. I try, man. It's like you. It's sort of like I started as a guitar player and ended up interviewing people. So I don't know how
It's
that.
it's more of the good interviews are more like heart-to-heart conversations, and that's what this feels like.
Well, you know what? You said it. You said it in one of your. Here's your quote. You ready? The best interviews are two guys that are just talking about something they care about. That's your quote. And that's kind of like, well, as soon as I read that, I was like, well, this should be just fine.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I really had fun with this one.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Let me know if you need anything. I'll post this, and I'll also make some links to your YouTube channel so we can get some people over there. Just remind everybody, you know, what we talked about today is a tiny piece of the Van Halen part anyway, a tiny piece of what's up there. I spent 7 hours listening to these intently again. There's no way I could tell you everything that's in there. So go listen to these interviews and check out all the new stuff.
Lots more to come.
Yeah, listen to all the new stuff too. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for everything you've done, and hopefully we'll see you some other time in the future.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jas. See you later. Have a good day.